Impact of women in transforming society.
Anne McVicker, Director of WRDA.
Reflecting back on the last 35 years of conflict and post conflict times, what was the role of women in transforming society?
Okay, well, I think that's a very long question. So maybe it might make sense if I start at the very beginning. And I'm not going to start singing the sound of music here. So I was born in North Belfast. I'm one of 9 children. I Daddy was a barber. My mummy was a stay-at-home mom, obviously, with 9 children. Um, Went to school in North Belfast, and really that was growing up in the Troubles. And looking back on it now, geez, it must have been awful for my parents, because I've 5 brothers and 3 sisters, and it must have been a really scary time. Of course, whenever I look back on it now, I think of we had such great crack. um, but um, but anyway. When I then was doing A levels and that, I think I'd got this stage where I thought I just need to get out of here. So that's why I applied to Manchester, and I um, applied for law. Maybe half of me was thinking that I wouldn't get it, but I ended up getting the grades, and that's how I ended up doing law. Didn't necessarily want to do it, but it was a path out of Northern Ireland. So I went to Manchester and absolutely loved it. Had a great time, and then I went on to London in '82, and I did my solicitor's exams. And then after that, London's such a big place, and you feel so anonymous in it. Um, and at that stage, I felt that I wanted to go back home, and so I came back home. I think that was sort of like '83, the end of '83, and I'd made up my mind at that stage that I didn't really want to do law, um, but I wanted to do something connected to it. So I started getting involved in on a voluntary basis in housing rights, because I was living over this side of the town at the time, and then I applied for a job and I got it, and it was a welfare rights officer, and it was working over in North Belfast, um, and that was the time that the social security system was changing. There was no longer sort of like going to be single payments. So basically, my job was I was working in the Bone area and in the Lower Old Park area, and basically it was going around knocking doors and saying, "Do you know that the system is changing? Have you put on weight? Have you lost weight? Do you have a settee? Do you have a kitchen table, etc.?" And help people with their claims. And actually, I loved that work because these were payments that people were entitled to, and the system was changing, and it did make a difference. And then after that, I got a job as housing liaison officer, and actually that was working in the Lower Shankill estate, and so it was really working with the residents association, and who actually were predominantly women. No surprises there. And it was about trying to the women were trying to bring about change in their housing conditions, because that was where the Weetabix, or the flats, which were known as Weetabix flats, which were absolutely awful, and they had just been demolished at that stage, and the housing was awful. But um, but anyway, that group of women were just, they were fantastic. They just wanted to make changes, and it wasn't about just their own houses. It was about everybody living in the community, and even beyond on up the Shankill. Um, but that group of women then wanted more, and at that stage we had the Workers' Education Association, which is now gone, which is such a pity. And we had the forerunner to WRDA at the time, which was the WEP, the Women's Education Project. And anyway, by contacting them, we were able to get training, and the women just loved it. And really, to sort of just fast forward a bit, that was how the Lower Shankill Women's Group was born. Um, and that group of women were just wanted everything. At that stage, we were kind of meeting in a community centre, which was, you know, just one room. So because our links were pretty good with the housing executive, they ended up giving us a property on the Shankill Road just below where the housing executive was, and it was fantastic, and it was just this building. It only had windows to the front of the building and no windows, you know, at the back, and we got money and we got it all refurbished, and we had a creche, and we had an advice office, and we had space for classes, and we had a kitchen area, and we called it the Hummingbird. And the reason why we called it the Hummingbird was because the hummingbird shouldn't actually be able to fly because of its shape, but the hummingbird doesn't know that, and the hummingbird can fly and flies backwards, and that was why it was called the hummingbird. And really, the women just again they just wanted everything. They wanted again they want childcare. They wanted facilities and provision for their children. You know, like for kids, for summer schemes, for young women, you know, for young men. They just wanted it all. And really, that then started to develop then into what's now known as the Shankill Women's Centre. Now, at that time, remember, this was all during the conflict or the Troubles, and but actually there was, looking back on it now, there was quite a lot of cooperation, networking, between the different women's groups and centres that there were at the time. And I remember there at one stage, I just can't remember the year now, but there was a proposal to close down the Royal Maternity Hospital and establish it at the city. And there was a big campaign that was going on, and actually women from the Lower Shankill Women's Group, we actually went over to Bostic House and took part in the meetings and were part of that campaign because you know, the women wanted the maternity hospital to stay open in the Royal, and that was a successful campaign, and that was fabulous. And remember as well that gender equality and women's rights and anything to do with equality wasn't on the agenda because we were going through this conflict, and it was all about the constitutional, you know, question and where we're going to go and that, and there would have been women who were, I mean, violence against women and girls was rife, and I would say that that wasn't just in Shankill. I would say that that was across all communities, and there was one thing I suppose that maybe united all churches and communities was their opposition to abortion. In fact, you wouldn't have even used the word abortion, it just wasn't used. And quite a lot of women's groups and centres and women generally would have also been very much opposed to abortion. But, you know, women need abortions because things happen in their lives, and so women would have presented at Shankill Women's Centre and needing an abortion, and there was very little information. In fact, I think it was only the Family Planning Association were the only organisation at that time that would have given sort of like information and that on it. But you know, there would have been women who were raped, you know, women who were in very violent relationships, and there would have been young girls as well who needed abortions. And what would have happened was that I would have rang around sort of like other women's groups and women's centres and asked for donations. And the same thing would have happened if it had been Falls Women's Centre, ringing Shankill Women's Centre. This is what happened. And so women did travel because obviously abortion was illegal in Northern Ireland. So women who needed abortions had to travel to England to obtain those. Now, all of this all had to happen under the radar. Obviously, if the Shankill community had have known what was going on in the Hummingbird, I'm sure that we would have been, you know, got our windows put in, or, you know, got firebombed or whatever. But I think it's also another example of how, you know, what was going on during the conflict in terms of sort of like the women's movement. All of that cooperation, sharing, coming together. I mean, that's classic community development. I also remember at one stage Belfast City Council took away Shankill or Falls Women's Centre's funding, and Shankill Women's Centre, then we come out in support of Falls Women's Centre. We got our funding taken off us as well. And I think I remember as well that that time Ballybean Women's Centre, they had lost their funding from Castlereagh Council. And we actually, Shankill Women's Centre, we actually went down, we met with councillors, we were invited into a meeting, making a case, you know, like for our funding to be restored, and that kind of all fell on deaf ears. I suppose the one good thing that did come out of that was that a few years later, Belfast City Council actually reviewed their whole policy in relation to funding and created a new fund. And so a few years later, Shankill Women's Centre got her funding back again, which was great. So there was all these, as I say, campaigns, but that was all, you know, all very much sort of like, you know, it had to be sort of like done behind closed doors. I mean, I can remember also, actually it was a councillor at the time, Patricia Loosley, and she came over to the Shankill. I think it might have been, we're talking about funding. And I remember sort of like that meeting was taking place. It was taking place maybe in late afternoon or early evening, and we had shutters on the front of the Hummingbird, and you know, I remember, you know, Patricia coming in to meet with the women to talk about sort of like how we could, you know, how we could get our funding back, or and that, and the advices, and but we had to wait on Patricia getting in and then pull the shutters down, you know. So actually, whenever I reflect back on it now, you took all these things for granted, but and maybe if you had have actually thought about it at the time, you couldn't have really carried on in a situation like that. So it is amazing, you know, what you actually put up with. But anyway, after Shankill Women's Centre, then I moved on. No, before I left Shankill Women's Centre, I do remember the ceasefires, and I remember I had my two youngest in their car seats, and I had pulled in to the car park at Shankill Women's Centre. At this stage, we had moved into the new centre in Agnes Street, and I heard the announcement from Gusty Spence about the UVAF and the loyalist ceasefires, and I felt totally overwhelmed. I remember thinking, like, my boys were only, you know, they were only babies, they're both under two, and it just kind of felt like such a relief that there was a potential for things to change. But I think it took sort of like a few years after that, because we didn't really know how it was all going to, how it was all going to pan out. I do think that at that stage, sort of like women's centres and that, there was more open meetings, like public meetings. There was more discussion. We were starting to talk about like a women's agenda, what that would look like. I think we're kind of a bit overwhelmed as well, I know that, at that stage, the Women's Aid were still sort of like in their early years of, like opening refuges and that. So violence, like against women, was still very up there. I know at that stage we had the sex discrimination order, um, and there was the like of I think fair employment legislation was starting to come in, but I think it took us sort of like a while to kind of like adjust. And in fact, what we decided to do was to carry out some research, and we at this stage we had established the Women's Support Network, and there was a piece of research, and it was carried out by Ruth Talion, and it was called Grant Aided or Taken for Granted. And it was really to find out, first of all, how many women's groups and centres and organisations existed throughout Northern Ireland, and then how they were funded. And what we found out was that there was hundreds of women's groups and organisations, but whenever you looked at their funding, a lot of them were operating voluntary or operating on a shoestring. And I think that then that's how we started to frame sort of our agenda in going forward.
Looking forward, what's next for women's peace building and the women's sector?
Well, after I left Shankill Women's Centre in 1999, I headed up then Women's Tech. And Women's Tech was about enabling women into non-traditional training and employment. And because there's such an underrepresentation of women in the construction sector, and other sectors, engineering, etc. And again, reflecting back, that goes to show you how things were starting to change in Northern Ireland. Because prior to the ceasefires, Women's Tech would just not have got off the ground at all. So things were starting to change in terms of gender and representation, etc. Also at this stage, I am aware that there was things were starting to happen. There was talk about having a gender equality strategy, and in fact the gender equality strategy was launched in 2006. There were starting to be kind of like meetings where women, were invited in and talking about equality issues. So gradually, there things were starting to change. I think that 2010 onwards is a significant period. Um, I'm aware that 2000 and I think 2010, 2011, that was actually when Alliance for Choice formed, and also when Reclaim the Agenda formed, and and they were quite significant because I think that Alliance for Choice obviously started to change the language in relation to abortion and like reproductive health, etc., and rights, and also Reclaim the Agenda really started to, I think, galvanise the women's centres under the umbrella of six key aims, and they were about about addressing poverty, about healthcare that suited our needs, about more women, being visible in in politics and public positions, um, childcare. Childcare. I think we're still waiting on a childcare strategy, and and violence against women and girls. It started to articulate what the what the issues were in terms of the women's movement, and also Reclaim the Agenda. Also, kind of revised or brought back the International Women's Day rally. And not that they invented it, because it used to happen years before that, but there had been kind of like a period, maybe of about 10 years, where there were no rallies. And and I remember actually the first rally in 2011, which was to coincide with the centenary of International Women's Day. And like there was maybe about 100 of us outside City Hall. I think on a wee platform. Whenever I think of International Women's Day now, like there's thousands that come out for it, and even we have learned, like even sort of like moving on that like the last lot of years, it costs a lot more because we have had to take into account accessibility. Even the like of like portaloos and things like that, because there's no point saying, like we're all for women if it's only some women. You have to be able to include all women. Should it be, like disabled women and ethnic minority women, and so you know you can't just make these bold statements and then sort of like qualify them. Um, and look at Alliance for Choice and look at how well they did. It is ironic in a way that ultimately abortion and marriage equality were brought about by Westminster, um, but nonetheless, it did happen, and that is much to be celebrated there as well. Also, actually, RSA was brought about by Westminster, and I note that since 2018, nothing really has happened about that, but we're still on that campaign. And I think that yes, there is, like, we haven't got equality yet. Haven't got it, but there has been progress. It has been a long and bumpy road, and there have been many ups and downs, but there has been progress, and that is to be acknowledged. There's still a long way to go. I think that one of the biggest issues in Northern Ireland to women at the minute is violence against women and girls, and I really welcome the launch just earlier this year of the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy and their action plan. I think that that is just tremendous. Um, there's also, I think there have been some things that have happened, um, that um, in terms of how women are treated uh, in the courts in relation to serious sexual offences. And actually that is how how Raise Your Voice Against Sexual Harassment, how that project was formed, which WRDA lead on along with our partners. Um, and that project has done, it's just done so well. There's just such a need to inform, you know, everybody in society, because everybody's got a responsibility here, in terms of sexual harassment, and also looking at that like pyramid of violence, it's not acceptable. It's just not acceptable, like whistling, calling out, um, victim blaming. It's just not good enough. We are on the start of a journey. There it really is much to celebrate. Um, we've still got we've still got a long way to go. Um, but whenever I talk to my colleagues, and I talk to within WRDA and within our sister organisations, everybody's up for the fight, because what do you do when rights are under attack? You stand up and fight back, and that's what we're all going to do.